So this second week of the sermon series, The Beginner's Guide to the Kingdom of Heaven. This week I entitled it, Going Above and Beyond. I hope that will become clear as to the choice for this title. We grow up with rules. We still live with rules. No matter how chronologically advanced we become, we live with rules. Rules rule. They're at home, they're at the office, they're at school, they're on the road, they're everywhere. We now have COVID rules. And quite frankly, I can't wait for those rules to be removed from our daily life in the not-so-distant future. But don't break the rules yet. So it's no surprise, is it, that in God's kingdom, the kingdom of heaven, we're going to find some rules. When Jesus wanted to lay out the ethical agenda for God's kingdom, he didn't ditch the rules that were long ago written down by God on tablets of stone and handed to Moses. Instead, he fulfilled those rules by embodying them and teaching them and doing so with authority. For Jesus, the rules were still important, but the principles behind the rules were even more important. It wasn't just about what was written in stone. It was about the character and law of God written on the hearts of people. Not just stones, but on the hearts of people. Go back and read Jeremiah and this endeavor for the law to be on the heart. And so the scribes and the Pharisees, they knew the law or the rules. They knew them backward and forward. And as the self-appointed legal conscience of the people, or the rule keepers of Israel, they were bound and determined to make sure everyone obeyed the law to the letter. The scribes acted as lawyers for the law of Moses, and the Pharisees believed that God's kingdom would come only when the people of Israel all obeyed that law perfectly. The problem with that approach, however, is that focusing on the law alone imposes limits on obedience, since I only have to comply with the law and nothing more. A Pharisee evaluated himself and others based on compliance to the rules, not on the basis of compassion towards others or the needs of the community. It is for this reason that Jesus drops what I propose is a bombshell of a statement in verse 20 of chapter 5. For I tell you that unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. If the people thought the scribes and the Pharisees had it all together because they obeyed the law to the letter, then they were missing the point. The law points to something bigger, Jesus says. It points out the way of living as the community of God's kingdom. So Jesus establishes a pattern. Some commentators call it a formula of sorts, a pattern within the Sermon on the Mount. This is the atmosphere, the context to which Jesus is sharing these words, this formula. He uses words, he uses the law as commandments as they were shared by Moses. And so the phrase, you heard me, I tried to emphasize it in the reading, you have heard that it was said. That would have been attributing it to Moses. And the compassionate community in building intent behind it, then Jesus says, but I say to you. Now, some of you that have heard me before, and you know that I paraphrase some things. I've paraphrased it more like, it used to be this way, but now it's this way. You have heard it said, but I say to you. I don't think I'm that far off. Well, the law of Moses was designed to show Israel how to live together in a world of human authority. Jesus wants to discuss what it means to live in a world of divine authority, aka God's kingdom. So Jesus takes the law and he radicalizes it, shaking it down to the roots of the law's intent. Jesus is rooted in the law, but he calls his disciples to live a life of much deeper rootedness than the legalism of the scribes and the Pharisees. The Pharisees were concerned with what people did and did not do with their hands. Jesus was more concerned about what people had in their hearts and how that would translate into their relationships with people as a sign of God's new world, as a sign of the kingdom of heaven. So before we explore a few of the statements that Jesus made to those who gathered at the foot of the mountain, I share with you this understanding. Jesus is setting up an ideal community, kingdom. And by following the commandments or the statements, as Jesus interprets them, those who follow him walk as if they have one foot already in the kingdom of heaven. Remember, Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is at hand. I would love to take each one of Jesus' statements, but again, this section that I read today could be an entire sermon series in its own right. So I will focus on only a few and hopefully offer a sense of understanding that can be applied to the others. Now, I'm going to focus on two of these, you have heard it said, but I say to you, exchanges that Jesus shared from the mountain of the Beatitudes. I want to look first at this statement. You have heard it said, to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. Well, do not murder. It was one of the original 10 Commandments. Murder destroys the humanness of another. And thus, the law of Moses minces no words. Murder is something to be avoided, which most of us are able to do. How many times have we heard people say something like, well, what I did was bad, but at least I didn't kill anyone. And yet, And yet, while it's clear that we should avoid murdering the body of another, Jesus radicalizes the old commandment and goes above and beyond. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. Anger. Jesus understood that the dehumanizing act of murder has its roots in the dehumanizing of another person through our anger. And not only does anger dehumanize the other, Jesus felt it dehumanizes us too. Every time we decide to allow anger to smolder inside of us, I'm suggesting we become less than fully human, less than the people God created us to be. Instead of merely avoiding murder, we should embrace reconciliation, which leads to the community, the kingdom of heaven. It's the difference between following the rule and engaging a relationship. The difference between avoiding doing something with our hands and doing something with our heart. Again, Jesus' statements, all of Jesus' statements are worth applying and worth focusing on. But today, I'm going to offer comments on one more instead of all of them. Again, Jesus used this formula. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. I'm just going to cut to the quick. For Jesus, it wasn't about limiting revenge. It was about rejecting any kind of retaliatory violence. Jesus wanted his disciples to reject the revenge fantasy in favor of the redemption factor for both the offended and the offender. This little voodoo doll image. Some of us wish we had one of those from time to time. And some of us have been the recipient of the revenge of others. Revenge is all about making ourselves feel better and superior to the one who has hurt us. Jesus, however, calls his disciples to lean into the hard work of redemption through suffering love. Jesus' disciples aren't to go about asserting their personal rights when they are affronted, but instead they are to respond in terms of the good and the needs of the other, even when the other commits evil against them, against us. So Jesus says we need to love people, especially our enemies, because it doesn't take much moral force to love a friend now, does it? Jesus commands us to do something counterintuitive. Love those unlikely to be loved. Love the poor. Love your enemy, love your coworker, love the conservative, love the liberal, love the person least like you. Love the blue states and love the red states. This is the love of God. And if this love is extended to us, who are we to not extend it to others? Even those who have sinned against us. Bottom line, we are not to dish out to offenders what we feel they deserve. For indeed, this is not how God has dealt with us. I have not received what I deserve. I have received grace, and I'm grateful for that. Instead, we are to be the embodiment of Christ in forgiving and loving the other. We don't deal with evil by indulging in revenge fantasies, but by living the vision of God's offer to love and redemption for all. Jesus demonstrated this all the way to the cross, refusing to take revenge, and instead offering his forgiveness and offering his love to those who nailed him on that cross. Jesus overcame evil with suffering love. He overcame evil with good. And that, my friends, is going above and beyond. And that is how we are to live in the kingdom of heaven. I hope that you'll take some time and reflect on the sermon notes that I've posted, so that we might have a discussion about this at the Kingdom Chat on Tuesday. You can read more about that and how to get on to that chat. But the thoughts for this week, especially in light of the events in Washington, D.C., they call us to look inward and not outward. For it is there that we will come to the root of what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the kingdom of God. We, followers of Jesus, have the ability, and I suggest strongly, we have the responsibility to tell people about God's world through the way we admit our faults and the way we cling to Christ, in the way we love our enemies, in the way we feed the needy, in the way we strive to keep our promises, and so much more, which Jesus goes on to outline later in the Sermon on the Mount. Members of the kingdom of God, of the kingdom of heaven, those who have been chosen by grace and brought to life in this love. We, you, me, us, we have a response. We have a surprising usefulness in this hurting, angry world when we respond to that grace by walking in a most radical way in love. Not just following the letter of the law, but going above and beyond. That's right, we have the opportunity, the responsibility, through the way we live our lives, to help usher the kingdom of heaven into this world. And you might agree with me when I say, from what I saw this past week, the kingdom of heaven needs some help being ushered in to this world.